right, we'll transition to Jim's talk on the Clean Water Act and on his work at the federal EPA. Jim, I think you're muted.
Okay, we
There
got
you
it?
go. Yep.
Great. My name is Jim Vinch. I'm a Miami grad, and I'm an attorney at US EPA in Washington, D.C. I work in our civil enforcement program doing work enforcing the Clean Water Act. So I focus my practice primarily on, well, only on the Clean Water Act. And I just, before I start with my remarks today, I just have to say that the remarks I'm going to make today are my own personal remarks, and they don't necessarily represent the remarks of US EPA or the federal government. And now that I've said that, I'm free to share my opinions with you. So to get started, and just to give you a little bit of background about the Clean Water Act, the country survived for about 150 years without really any uniform standard of water regulation in this country. I think before next year will mark the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And before that time, I think the best thing you can say about the water resources in the United States was you could be fairly confident that if you took a drink out of your tap water, it wasn't going to kill you. Beyond that, you really couldn't say much about it. There was no uniform system of regulation. It was most of what regulation existed was devolved to the states. The states obviously took different approaches to how they wanted to handle water resources. Some states had priorities that, don't prioritize environmental values and instead prioritize economic values. So you know how that's going to end out. I think that some major events occurred in the late 1960s, early 1970s that led to not only the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, but also the passage of the Clean Water Act. A lot of folks point to the fact that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in 1969, and that certainly was a attention-grabbing event. But I don't think you could put all of the responsibility for the environmental revolution on that simple act. I think that it was a culmination of a number of things, including the technological revolution that the country was going through, the social revolution that we were going through with the Vietnam War and other kinds of social issues. The fact that a few years before we saw, I think, the first view of the world from space, from the moon, and I think folks looked at the Earth and could see it as this blue marble floating out in space, and could see how fragile it was. And I think it was a combination of all of these things that just happened at the right time that spurred the United States to finally adopt the Clean Water Act, which they did in 1972 over President Nixon's veto. So we've been working with the Clean Water Act now for almost 50 years, and Congress, when they passed the Clean Water Act, really, I think they did a remarkable job for where they were at the time. Really, at that point, we didn't have a lot of good scientific understanding and data about how water systems function. And so, nevertheless, they were able to sketch out a broad regulatory program that went a long way to improving water quality. It hasn't gotten us where we need to be, but I think that it's really made some major advancements in improving our water in the United States. When Congress passed the Clean Water Act, they had three very ambitious goals in mind. Those were to eliminate all discharges of pollutants to navigable waters by 1985, to achieve what's called the fishable, swimmable goals by 1983. And that meant that the waters by 1983 should generally be safe for swimming and fishing, shellfish harvesting, and other recreational activities in the waters. And finally, the third goal was to eliminate toxic pollutants in toxic amounts. I think now, 50 years later, looking back on some of those goals, we can see that they were probably overly optimistic. The first one about eliminating discharges of pollutants to navigable waters by 1985, obviously we're not there, right? I mean, our waters are still, although they're improved, they're substantially improved from where they were in the 1960s and 70s. We have a long way to go to realize the goal of achieving zero pollutants into waters of the United States. For the most part, I think we've seen market improvement in the fishable and swimmable goal. I think that for the most part, the states, the general water quality has improved throughout the country. I think the stats are, at the time the Clean Water Act was passed, I think like 60% of our waters were not fishable and swimmable. And I think today, roughly, we can say that about 40% of our waters are not fishable and swimmable. Now that's, those aren't great statistics. It's only a 20% improvement or so. But I think it's a very significant gain and improvement. So, we've got a long way to go with the Clean Water Act. It's not perfect, but like I like to say that, even with all its imperfections, I still consider it to be the gold standard of water regulation in the world. We have countries coming to us at EPA all the time that are looking to us for guidance on how to establish water regulation in their countries. And so, I think they've seen the improvements that we've made, and I think they've seen, historically anyway, the approach that we have taken has for the most part worked. We can talk about some of the other problems with the Clean Water Act later in this discussion. So I just want to talk a little bit about how the Clean Water Act works. The Clean Water Act regulates pollutants in several important ways. First of all, it requires that all point source discharges of pollutants meet technology standards. And that simply means that, when you think about pollution, water pollution, you usually think about a manufacturing facility sitting on the edge of a lake or a river with a pipe coming out of it and pollutants pouring out of that pipe into the water body. Those are what are commonly known as point sources. And so those kinds of sources of discharge of pollutants are relatively easy to control because they're identifiable. They have an owner, a responsible party, and they are in a discrete location, so they can be controlled. Point source discharges are generally controlled through technological standards. So EPA specifies a given level of technology that has to apply to dischargers of the same industrial category. And so they then impose those standards through permits. So that's the first sort of layer of protection for waters. The second sort of backup layer is that the Clean Water Act requires the states to adopt designated uses for each and every water body in their state. So the state has to conduct essentially an inventory of all of their waters, every segment of waters, every pond, every lake, every body that they consider to be a water. And they have to determine for each water body what those water bodies' designated uses will be. And the designated uses specify the types of uses that the water body is capable of achieving. So states, for instance, will identify water bodies as either primary contact recreation, secondary contact recreation, aquatic habitat, drinking water source, things like that. The states then have to develop water quality criteria to support those uses. And so the water quality criteria are then translated into permit terms, which further restrict the discharges from these point sources. So from this brief discussion, I've outlined that point sources are fairly well defined and fairly well controlled. What a gaping hole, though, in the Clean Water Act is that, sources of pollution that aren't point sources, and in general, I'll just call them non-point sources, are not generally regulated by the Clean Water Act. Those types of sources of pollution are generally stormwater runoff, agricultural pollution, and these types of pollution sources are difficult to control because first of all, they're influenced primarily by rain events or precipitation events, which, they come at sporadic intervals. The rain events flow across the ground. They pick up pollutants as they're flowing across the ground. As they flow to the water body, they transport those pollutants to a water body. But the problem there is that how do you identify who's responsible for pollution that flows through sheet sources of flow to water bodies? It's not like with a point source where you have an owner and an operator and you can hold that person liable. Furthermore, for agricultural sources of pollution, the Clean Water Act has exempted many agricultural facilities from the Clean Water Act itself. So farming operations, for various reasons, are exempt from Clean Water Act coverage, which is now a very difficult problem. And in Ohio, I think it's most typified by the situation that we have going on in Lake Erie right now with the hazardous algal blooms that are taking place in the western basin of Lake Erie. And I think the state of Ohio is on track to start tackling those problems, but we're still a long way from resolving them. So, even with, well, one more point that, so far I've talked to you about the federal system of water pollution control, but I just want to let you know that the states also share responsibility in controlling pollution in this country. The states are all can decide to implement their own Clean Water Act programs in their state if they apply to the federal government. If the federal government approves or authorizes the program, the states are free to run their own programs. In that type of situation, like in Ohio, where the state of Ohio has been authorized to run its own Clean Water Act program, the federal government sort of serves as a backstop. We're watching over their shoulder. We're making sure that they're implementing things correctly. To the extent that they're not enforcing the Clean Water Act, we might step in and do something about it. So as a general observation, I think, while the Clean Water Act is imperfect, it contains most of the tools necessary to get us where we need to go. And I think the primary impediment to the success is the lack of political will, frankly. As a nation, we've addressed all of the low-hanging fruit, and we've successfully tackled to successfully tackle the remaining problems, it's going to take much more courage and dialogue. And where we are in the country right now, I find that to be a chasm I'm not sure we're going to be able to reach across at this point. But there are positive examples. For instance, and I know on Donna's slide, she showed the Chesapeake Bay, and historically the Chesapeake Bay has been a source of innumerable environmental problems. And President Obama, I think in 2010, made it a goal of his administration to clean the Chesapeake Bay up. And the issue there that involves 6 states and the federal government, and to coordinate environmental protection for one state is a significant enough problem, but to coordinate it with 6 states, it's been a huge challenge, and we haven't seen the results yet, the final results, but it looks like the states and the EPA are on a pathway to make remarkable progress in the Chesapeake Bay. So the Clean Water Act can work. So I just wanted to now talk for a few minutes about what we've experienced over the last 4 years under the Trump administration. And this is the primary reason why I had to give the disclaimer at the outset of my talk, because there's some things that happened during the Trump administration that I have to say were extremely atypical. I have served at the EPA through various administrations, Republican and Democrat. And while all the administrations have their policy priorities, the Trump administration was something completely different. It sought to remake EPA in its own image, and it basically ignored core principles of the agency that were even necessary to make it function. And by that, I'm talking about the science and data. The science and data were not prioritized. They were often I don't know if hidden is the correct word, but our agency is staffed with a lot of scientists and a lot of legal experts. And under most administrations, Republican or Democrat, the political appointees at the agency will solicit the advice of the career staff because they're the ones that have the expertise. The Trump administration did not do that at all. They basically did not include us in any of the decisions. The decisions were made behind closed doors for the most part. The staff were always surprised by the decisions that the Trump administration made. One big example of this, and I just thought I would talk about this because Donna's presentation raised a lot of good issues about the importance of streams. And, so we have been struggling at the agency for years now with how to define what waters are protected by the Clean Water Act. It started with a Supreme Court case in 2006, and it's been sort of chaos ever since. During the Obama administration, we adopted a rule trying to normalize what the agency considered to be waters of the United States protected by the Clean Water Act. And we adopted a rule that was based on thousands and thousands of pages of scientific data. In an effort to protect all kinds of waterways, not just those that Donna showed that looked on a map like pretty waterways, but other types of waterways too that most people wouldn't consider waterways, but nevertheless they had environmental values irrespective of how often they flowed or how they appeared. And here I'm mainly talking about it's common for people to understand waterways as being things that flow perennially. The issue gets more difficult when you're talking about streams that don't flow on a perennial basis, that flow maybe only ephemerally. And that's a huge problem out west. And most of Donna's slides showed pictures of streams in the east where they're clearly recognizable as streams. There's stream corridors with vegetation and buffers on the side. You can see water running in most of them. But out west, the problem is streams don't flow on a perennial basis, a regular basis. They flow irregularly. And so the Trump administration basically came in and gutted our clean water protection rule and went back to some, I would have to say a very minority view of what constitutes a water of the United States, significantly limiting the types of waters that are considered to be waters of the United States.
Jim, I'm sorry to interrupt. You've got about 30 seconds left before we have to wrap up.
Okay, so I think that I just wanted to say that under the Trump administration, under the Biden administration, we don't know yet what's going to happen. We just had our administrator appointed last week, and I think the sense that I have is that this Water of the United States rule that undid the Obama era rule is likely to be challenged and likely to be reviewed by the administration. And I would suspect, but I don't know, that we're going to promulgate a new rule. The other thing I want to point out is that, one of the big focuses now of the Biden administration is going to be environmental justice. We're looking at communities that have been suffering disproportionate impacts from either lack of safe drinking water or wastewater problems, where the communities are communities of color, communities with extreme poverty, communities of low education. We're already targeting cities across the country where we see this problem, where this problem has been ignored for years. And I think we're going to start focusing on this in a major way at the agency. So I'm hoping that these new initiatives are going to reinvigorate the agency. Really, the first task of the Biden administration is going to be to rebuild everything that was destroyed over the past 4 years, including from the staff level on up, because it's going to take a tremendous amount of work to get us to where we were under the Obama administration, and I think it's going to be a long haul. But I think I'm confident that we're going to be back where we were before, and we're going to be doing science and we're going to be following the law. And I'm confident that our water bodies are going to be safeguarded in the way they were intended when Congress passed the Clean Water Act.
Thank you, Jim. And I know that this was a session that was just chock full of information, from climate and the oceans to thinking about the function of freshwater streams and how to protect them, to Jim's insight in terms of the value of the Clean Water Act and where it's going in the future. So I'm glad, Jim, that we ended on a positive note, and Donna, we had a number of things going on in Butler County and nationally, initiatives that we could hook into, and Hayes talking about some of the initiatives, albeit they are falling short, it sounds like, at the Great Barrier Reef. So that will conclude our panel today. I